In the 20th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, we find that Christ has been traveling with his disciples from Galilee into Judea to the other side of the Jordan, preaching and healing the masses that followed and crowded around him. All the while, he's getting closer and closer to Jerusalem, knowing the fate that's awaiting him, seeking earnestly to impart knowledge and understanding of God's kingdom upon anyone who will listen, but especially his disciples. He's just met a man of great wealth who was asking about eternal life. So Jesus tells him to keep the commandments and to give what he has to the poor. He tells him that last part so that there might be nothing holding him back, literally nothing holding him back from following the ways of God. And when he explains how difficult it is for those who are dependent upon earthly goods to actually enter God's kingdom, his disciple Peter says, "We left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us?" Now, hearing this question, and then perhaps anticipating that the mother of the Zebedee boys, of James and John, will soon make an absurd request that her sons be able to sit next to Jesus in the places of honor and glory in heaven, Christ looks at his disciples and reminds them that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And he does it by telling them this parable found in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Jesus said to the disciples, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You also go into my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' And so they went. When he went out again at about noon and 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' And they said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' And so he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call all the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last, and then go into the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. So now when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous?' So, Jesus says, the last will be first, and the first will be last." If you know the Gospel of Matthew, you may find it surprising to see this parable held with its pages, and yet in none of the other Gospels. It is, after all, at its heart, a parable about grace. If we know anything about Matthew's Gospel, it's that he's not normally one who seems to dwell very much on grace. He's very much an actions have consequences. You get what you deserve. There's salvation, yes, but that does not take away from your responsibility to the law. He's that kind of guy. So when I see that Matthew has included a parable about God's grace, well, I tend to sit up and pay attention. For even Matthew, it seems, understands that in the midst of the behavioral obligations that follow our acceptance of Christ's good news, the reality is that God's kingdom and God's gift of grace turns our world upside down and completely reverses our expectations. Even Matthew, with his sheep and goats moralistic lessons about the cause and effect relationship between our ethics and maybe our ultimate destiny, even he knows that just when we think we have it all figured out, just when we think we have all the answers and understanding we need, Jesus rams a story like this at us that reminds us that we are playing by someone else's rules. And for us, that seems like one of the most unfair aspects of this life, does it not? We didn't make the rules. In fact, we weren't even consulted, and yet we have to live by them and work for their success. And how do we respond to this realization? Well, we grumble. We grumble because at the end of the day, God's kingdom doesn't work like we think it should. The God of justice, who is more importantly even the God of grace and forgiveness and mercy, works in ways that are not simply different, but are in fact often opposite from the ways that we would run this show if we were given the chance. Were it up to us, at least judging by the world that we've created around us, if you get something, it is only because you have earned it. Nothing is free in this world. If you work harder than someone else, well, maybe then you'll get a little bit more than they do. What's fair is fair. That's our understanding of justice. And in some ways, that makes good sense, doesn't it? That's how you run a good business. That's how people get along sometimes. If you give everyone more than they deserve, we'd all go bankrupt, wouldn't we? At least that's what we ask. It seems as though it is against our human nature to operate any differently. And doing so would seem scandalous in our world. But thanks be to God that we are dealing with Christ's nature and not our own. Christ's ultimate goal isn't fairness, it's grace. It's returning the world to the dream God always intended it to be, where we all live in a relationship with God, free from any impediment, especially our own propensity to try to do things our way instead of God's, that results in our sin. I wonder what those workers would have thought when they saw the vineyard owner himself walking through the marketplace to hire laborers. That would have already gone against the accepted business practices of the time. He would have likely sent a representative instead of going himself. But by telling it like this, Christ displays the way that God actively seeks out those who would serve as laborers in God's vineyard. And each time he goes back to the marketplace, he encounters someone new who has not yet been given a job. And each time he comes across workers that were apparently less and less desirable to society, until at the end of the day, he meets a group of workers that no one else wanted. "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" he asks. "Because no one would hire us. No one wanted to give these guys a chance." It's not that these workers were necessarily lazy or that they were no jobs to be found. These workers were the ones that everyone else refused to hire, it seems. They didn't fit the mold. And that is when I hear Christ telling me that God may be purposefully seeking out those who do not fit my mold at all. We're left to imagine the reasons these workers were considered unsuitable. Perhaps there were another race or social class. Perhaps they came from a different part of town where the so-called good, respectable citizens refused to go. Perhaps they lived life in a way that the so-called upstanding people of faith just could not bring themselves to have enough grace to condone. Whatever the reason, these workers did not fit the mold. And yet the vineyard owner sought them out and showed them that in his fields they were welcome. In fact, they were wanted. It may have been the very first time that they ever felt wanted and accepted. And it may have been the first time that they could show what they were made of, what they could do in the fields given the chance. And that's how it is with Jesus. We expect him to be in one place, and we find him in another. We expect him to join us at our lunch table, and yet we find him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, hanging out with all of the wrong sorts of people. And when we are caught grumbling because of the grace given to those who do not fit in with us, God takes those molds that we have made and shatters them, replacing them with his own. Since we are playing by God's rules and not our own, do not be surprised when you reach the gates of heaven and once inside, you find those people that we could not accept here to be the very ones that Christ embraces there. But hiring these undesirable workers wasn't enough. Christ had to make the vineyard owner go one step further. When it came time to pay the workers, he paid each of them equally. He made the workers who had been hired just an hour before quitting time equal to those who had toiled all day in the sun. And that represents the root of our grumbling, doesn't it? That's the true scandal of God's kingdom. Those of us who have been part of the faith community the whole time, who have been faithful followers since we were in diapers, have a difficult time accepting that God would lift up someone else, someone different from us, perhaps someone who did not fit in with our faith community or any other for that matter, to the same level and status that we hold. We think we deserve better. After all, we've put in our time learning and worshiping and serving and praying. We think we've earned God's favor. We aren't jealous that others receive God's grace. We are jealous that they receive the same amount of grace that we do without having to do as much work as we did. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't make sense with our understanding of fairness and justice. But that's the thing about grace. Grace can never be earned. God's favor can never be earned. It's a gift. When grace is calculated or expected, or when we presume we've earned it, it ceases to be grace at all. God's grace is not based on some contractual agreement, but on a covenant in which God promises each of us everything and asks of us everything in return. Grace is never earned or understandable, but is always infinite and wonderful and marvelous and amazing. As faithful followers of Christ, we naturally identify with those workers who were first hired. But here Christ's challenge for us. Just because we have been here longer does not mean that we deserve any more grace than anyone else. Perhaps that is why we should also find ways to identify with the group that was hired last. We've all been rejected at some point. Many of us have felt unwanted and unworthy. But the good news of Christ is that we are free from the standards of greatness and acceptance found in this world. As we humble ourselves as servants, we are all welcome to serve in Christ's fields. There's a story also that says that there was once a successful farmer who had one son. This man's farm provided produce and livestock for markets throughout the country. Even in a downturned economy, this farmer seemed always capable of turning a profit. Those who knew him heard him attribute his success to the work ethic and determination of his laborers, not himself. And he seemed to know how to get the best out of those who worked for him. Even if he hired someone that no one else would, the farmer would find a way to make them one of the best workers around. The farmer began to age, as we all do, and eventually he passed away. When it came time to divide his estate, everyone was surprised to hear that the farmer had left all that he owned to be divided equally among his laborers. Remember that this farmer had a son, but his son never took an interest in the farm. He set his mind on other things. He watched as the workers toiled, but never chipped in, never lent a hand. He never did the work. He just enjoyed the luxuries afforded to him by being part of the family. But still, the son expected to receive the inheritance he felt he was owed and entitled to because of who his father was. Needless to say, that when the farmer's wishes were made known, no one was more shocked than the son, who received nothing. I tell this story because many of us have heard this passage taught and preached at different points in our lives. Hopefully, each time we have learned something new or discovered something that we had not seen before. It was once brought to my attention, there's a group that seems to be left out of this parable entirely. In this allegory, where we eventually understand the vineyard owner to be God and the payment as mercy, forgiveness, and grace, and the laborers as faithful followers of Christ, there's one group that is missing. The group that, like the farmer's son, is offered every opportunity to join in the labor in the vineyard, but refuses to do the work. It is not enough for us to simply call ourselves Christ followers and enjoy the luxuries that come with it and sit in judgment of others. It's not enough even to go through the motions of being part of a faith community. We must actively strive to be co-laborers with Christ in his fields. And that is why, even when the topic is grace, this parable is actually very distinctly Matthew's. I may be reading into what is left out, but I think he purposely dismisses the idea that we can call ourselves people of faith and then do nothing to back it up. God's grace is available to all who would receive it, but we must allow it to change our lives, and we must join Christ in his mission of serving others. Otherwise, we don't fit into this story at all. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. I've thought about that saying a lot, and I've thought about the many images of God that are found throughout the Bible. Image of God is counselor and advocate, friend and lover, father and mother hen, lion and lamb. But when I think about Jesus as servant, embodying the first shall be last principle, I cannot help but picture Christ as I often picture my own mother and grandmothers and my mother-in-law, cooking an enormous meal for a hungry brood of children and grandchildren, sons-in-law and daughters-in-law and friends, the consummate hostesses. And we run to get to the front of the line, grabbing as much food as we can before the others could eat it. And my mother and my grandmothers and my mother-in-law would stand back, never eating, never sitting down, never stopping their work until everyone else has been served. And as we gathered around the table, each of us having been served enough food to make us burst, we could look into the eyes of these servant-hearted women and know that everyone was equally loved. May it be so in God's kingdom, where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And when you think about it, it doesn't give us much to grumble about, does it?